This weekend, we have seen what may be the biggest day of protest in this nation's history. People of all ages, genders, and sexualities, races, religions, and political persuasions took to the streets to march for women's rights. They went to city halls, state capitals, and our nation's capital, and they gathered in all 50 states and on every continent across the world. We marched to lift up a vision of freedom and justice, to voice the importance of protecting the rights, safety, health, and families of the most vulnerable, and to resist the leadership of the nation and remind them that we, the people, are the government. There was a groundswell of courageous hope as people took to the streets. I was with the crowd of thousands here in Dallas, marching from City Hall to East Dallas. Our church also had groups, as Daniel mentioned, present in Austin and in Washington, D.C. And my heart was filled seeing so many people show up. I hope we will continue showing up and speaking up as time goes on. Now, nearly a year ago, before we knew how things would unfold, your clergy team decided that we would preach this Sunday about Universalist women and their work for justice. And as today approached, we decided that what was needed now is moral courage. So last Sunday, this week, and the next, we focus on three people who exemplify this courage. And today, I want to tell you about a woman named Olympia Brown, a suffragist and the first woman ordained to the ministry by a denominational body in America. The images of events this weekend harken back to about 100 years ago. So much has changed, and yet. In 1917, at the age of 82, Olympia Brown was one of about 1,000 women who picketed in front of the White House in freezing rain and strong winds to demand a constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote. Some of the women chained themselves to the fence and were arrested and jailed. Some, including Brown, burned President Woodrow Wilson's speeches. The publicity around this rally pressured President Wilson to finally call for the passage of the 19th Amendment. Again and again, Universalist women have shown incredible courage and resilience in efforts to bend the arc of the universe toward justice. They stood at the forefront of major social reform movements of the 19th century because they believed that the kingdom of heaven must be built in a practical way in this world, and love made manifest for all people, rather than waiting for salvation in the hereafter. They worked for the abolition of slavery, for women's rights, temperance, prison reform, public hygiene, and peace, among other things. Their legacy was picked up again in the 20th century as women organized for reproductive choice and justice. It was members of this congregation's Women's Day Alliance who helped bring about the legalization of abortion in the Roe v. Wade case, a ruling made 44 years ago today. This is a momentous weekend for women and for everyone, really. We have come so far, and yet we have so far to go. So friends, we are going to need to cultivate courage and resilience. So today we look to Olympia Brown as a teacher to see how she overcame obstacle after obstacle and how her Universalist faith fueled her life's work. She was born in 1835 in Michigan to zealous, as they were described, Universalists and social reformers who taught their children about universal salvation, the brotherhood of man, as it was called then, and the importance of equal rights for women. These values were challenged, however, when she left for college. At Mount Holyoke, she encountered strict rules and weekly prayer meetings that talked of hellfire and brimstone. Her chemistry professor told her, "You are not expected to remember all of this, but only enough to make you intelligent in conversation." She left Mount Holyoke for Antioch College, which seemed better suited to her. Yet in her English class, women were not required to have their speeches memorized as the male students were. So, of course, she chose to deliver her speeches from memory. While at Antioch, she brought Antoinette Brown Blackwell to speak on campus. Blackwell was a Congregationalist minister ordained by a parish in New York, and it was the first time that she had ever heard a woman preacher. And she said it felt as though the kingdom of heaven were at hand. That was her call to ministry. She went on to write to all the seminaries she knew of requesting admission. The Unitarian school at Meadville said the trustees thought it would be too great an experiment to admit a woman. Oberlin replied that she could attend but not participate in public exercises. The president of St. Lawrence, a Universalist school in Canton, New York, replied that Olympia could be admitted, but that he did not think that women were called to the ministry. He didn't approve of women ministers, but he said that he would leave that between her and the great head of the church. And this, Olympia said, was exactly where it should be left, with God, of course. And so when she arrived at the seminary, she discovered that they had not expected her because the president had written so discouragingly. "I had supposed his discouragement was my encouragement," she wrote. Olympia was the only female student on campus. Faculty wives were unwelcoming and even hostile. Male students stood outside her window at night mocking her soft, high-pitched voice. And yet she proceeded with her studies to become a minister. She was well received at local churches where she preached, and so the St. Lawrence Universalist Association, led exclusively by male ministers, took up her request to be ordained. There was quite a debate, with clergy expressing concern that allowing women into the ministry would, quote, bring down the price of preaching. Eventually, they did vote to ordain her, though. In 1863, Olympia Brown became the first woman in America to be ordained with full denominational authority. She took up her call to preach, as she put it, a living religion that countered the great social and political evils of her day. And thus began her career as a parish minister. But women's rights was a cause that was woven into her ministry from the very start. In her first ministry at the age of 32, she took a summer off to campaign for universal suffrage in Kansas, facing down howling mobs of men who threw rocks at buildings where she was speaking or disrupted her speeches with shouting. She gave over 300 speeches in that one summer alone. Olympia's second ministry ended when, as she was on maternity leave, members decided that what we need here is a good man, and so they tried to end her ministry. She chose to resign. And she then moved on to the Universalist Church in Racine, Washington, where when she arrived, it was in the words of the church's clerk, in debt, hopeless, and doubtful whether any pastor could rouse them. She accepted the challenge, though. In looking back on her ministry many years later, she wrote that we might think it strange that she could only find a field in rundown or comatose churches, but that the prosperous churches were at the time led by men and had no interest in considering a woman as a minister. All I could do, she wrote, was to take some place that had been abandoned by others and make something of it, and this I was only too glad to do. She established the Racine Church as a vibrant center of learning, culture, and discussion of the social issues of the time. She invited prominent female speakers such as Julia Ward Howe, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony to the pulpit. Under her ministry, women began to vote and hold leadership positions in the church. And 9 years later, at the age of 53, she left this thriving congregation to devote her ministry full-time to activism for women's rights. Olympia's tireless work for women's suffrage was rooted in her Universalist faith. She said that voting rights involved not only the principles of democracy, but also the doctrine of the Golden Rule and its call for justice. She believed that God had given women an interest in their government and had intended men and women to rule side by side. She drew often from Scripture, saying that the founding fathers intended to create a nation in which there could be neither Jew nor Greek, nor bond, nor free, nor male, nor female. At a female colleague's ordination, Olympia told her to never forget the biblical exhortation, "Let no man despise you." Unlike some suffragists of the time who tried to pit women and African Americans against each other by calling for women's right to vote first, she worked for suffrage for both women and African Americans. She helped found multiple suffrage organizations, and at a point when the movement was languishing in the 1890s, she became a charter member of the more activist and confrontational National Women's Party. "I belonged to this party before I was born," she said. Not only did she receive criticism from men for her work, but women too, who considered marching and picketing improper and undignified behavior. Her response was that women had been dignified and proper for over 60 years, and we still do not have the right to vote. Olympia was one of the only early suffragists who lived long enough to vote in 1919. And the following year, she returned to her church in Racine to speak, and it was then that she voiced the words you heard from Reverend White as a reading earlier. Words that ring true almost a century later, calling us to stand by this faith and to keep working for our loftiest ideals. She testified to the importance of universalism in her life, ministry, and work for justice. Olympia's daughter said that ministry was her mother's calling because she believed that freedom of religious thought and a liberal church would supply the groundwork for all other freedoms. Her daughter described her as hopeful, courageous, indomitable, and uncompromising. She was not popular, she said. She cared little for society, paid no deference to wealth, represented an unfashionable church, and promoted a cause regarded as certain to be unsuccessful. And yet she prevailed. But Olympia Brown was not some kind of superwoman. She was a person like you and me. She was a person of faith who stood firmly in it, trusted in a God who ever lives and loves, and found comfort and strength in this. She faced hostility and discouragement almost every step of the way. She was tough and she was hopeful, and she did not give up. And neither should we. My question is, do we have the strength and resilience of Olympia Brown to face injustice in our time? I think what we've seen this weekend is evidence of such resilience. When we hear no, or you can't do that, we go forth nonetheless. When nasty words are thrown around, we respond with our highest ideals. When we are unsure if we will see the day when our hopes are realized, we keep working to build heaven on earth. And we are seeing a wave of courage and resilience that is only growing stronger. And this is why I remain hopeful. The author Amy Tan talks about resilience as the ability to find humor and irony in situations that would otherwise overpower you. This is why yesterday's marches, I think, were overwhelmingly pink. Even if you weren't there, perhaps you saw the aerial views shown in the media coverage. It was a sea of pink. And this was, of course, because marchers were wearing the pink woven pussy hats, or sometimes just cat ears, representing a reclaiming of power. Resilience also comes from a deeply held belief that there is goodness and grace in the world, that not all is lost. Albert Camus wrote in The Rebel that underneath the no proclaimed in protest, there is a yes, something that we can affirm and which moves us forward. Our first hymn this morning was a reminder to say yes to life, yes to truth, yes to love, in order to cultivate resilience. When we proclaim yes to another's no, we are living one of the lessons of Olympia Brown: to take others' discouragement as our encouragement. I believe that this is what sustained her courageous hope until the day when she did get to enjoy the fruits of her labors by casting her vote in 1919. The feminist theologian Mary Daly wrote that courage is a habit, a virtue. You get it by courageous acts. It's like you learn to swim by swimming. You learn to courage by couraging, she says. We know that even when we muster great courage to approach a situation, it sometimes results in disappointment, hurt, or failure. And so, alongside courage, we must cultivate resilience. The root of the word courageous, or courage, means heart. We must take heart, friends. The Reverend William Barber, leader of the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina, says that we are being called in this time to be the moral defibrillators of our time. The moral defibrillators of our time. He goes on to say, we must shock this nation with the power of love. We must shock this nation with the power of mercy. We must shock this nation and fight for justice for all. So take heart. Know that there is a courageous love which holds us all. It is within us, it is around us, and it is marching in the streets. Let us use this love to fuel the transformation that we wish to see in the world. May it be so. Amen.